All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. Today, I am honored to have Nana Meriwether with me. Nana is a very accomplished individual, and we're going to talk a lot about those accomplishments. But a couple of things that really stood out to me about her is one, just an amazing story of perseverance, continuing to go after what she wants and not stopping until she gets there. And then two, if you ever see her walking around listening to music, it's probably going to be Coldplay. So just wanted to highlight that. So
I love those random facts. It's so good.
no, hey, I heard that. I was like, man, just advocate for Coldplay. That's an interesting one, but we're cool with it. We're a roll.
I love it.
Oh, well, thanks for being on today, Nana.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
You betcha. So, talking about your growing up and kind of early years, a lot of people might assume as we hear this story that if we didn't start with the beginning, certain things about your background, but talk a little bit about your parents coming to the United States.
Yeah, so a lot of my life story is based very much and influenced by my parents. My dad is American. He grew up in the South. He was born in Tennessee, but grew up in South Carolina. And it was during civil rights, so he didn't have much growing up, but he used school as a way to better his life. And he ended up going to Michigan State. He was there for 3 years, graduated early, and was admitted into Duke University Medical School. And there he was the first African-American to attend and graduate. And my mother has a similar story in that she used education as a way to better her life. She was born and raised in South Africa during apartheid. She grew up in Soweto and studied really, really hard as much as she could and took all the opportunities that were available to her and got a United Nations grant to come study in the States. And to this day, she's a lawyer, she's the CPA, and she has an MBA. And my dad's a doctor. So.
Yes, so very accomplished individuals.
Yeah, that's what I've had to live up to. But from their life experience, they knew that school was really important, and they imparted that onto my brother, sister, and I. And so my siblings and I grew up in the DC area. And my parents gratefully put us into Sidwell Friends, which is where pretty much all the president's kids go. So if you're in DC and your mom's an ambassador or president, you go to Sidwell. Like my classmates were Chelsea Clinton, Al Gore's son was in my sister's grade. A lot of people worked for the World Bank, as I said, ambassadors and senators, and even it goes way back to the Roosevelts and Nixons, and even the Obama daughters went to Sidwell. So I went from 1st to 12th grade, and so that's all I knew. That Sidwell was all I knew, and yeah, it was a really amazing upbringing. You don't know what you're in until you leave, and then Facebook was made, and you're like, oh my gosh, your dad did that. That's your families. Like in context, I didn't really understand, and I was young, but it really imparted and planted in me the sense that I must aspire to things bigger than myself.
Hey, all I have to say is after the fact, now people are saying that about you. Can you believe I went to school with her?
That's hilarious, which it would be really cool because I was not very popular growing up. So
well, that's changing. That's changing.
Thank
you.
Yes.
So something that I think is interesting there is, once again, your folks had accomplished a lot. Now, everyone has different types of parents, right? Some parents kind of vocally express, hey, we have certain expectations of you. I love my parents to death, but they did that for me. And some parents, say, hey, we just want you to create your own path. So talk a little bit about, the upbringing and the way your parents parented you.
Yeah, so it was very subtle. They weren't very except for my dad. He really wanted me to become a doctor, and he still does. Like sometimes he'll email me like, oh look, this medical school is taking applications.
Just FYI.
Yeah. So they're really compassionate in that way, and they led by example. It wasn't like sitting us down and being like, you have to get straight A's and, go to Harvard. It was more, we saw my parents especially giving back to others. And they did a lot of work in Southern Africa. In fact, they met in the States. And then in the early 1980s, my dad was a professor at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and he was teaching about all these diseases like TB, but he'd never seen them in the field. So he was like, okay, to my mom, we're moving back to South Africa for a year. And so they did, and they stayed in a very rural town on the border of the Kruger National Park. What was to be a year, they spent actually 8 years. My dad worked in a rural hospital, and my mom would help the women of the village start small business and empower them. And over that 8 years, they helped over 500,000 people, because there was a civil war in Mozambique, so refugees would come into South Africa. And my dad would check them into the hospital, even if they were sick or not, so that they would not get thrown out of the country. So they started a mini refugee camp outside of our house and the hospital. And so I was born during this time. So I have a very philanthropic thread that runs through me, and it's influenced by my parents. And I'll talk a little bit about this probably later, but in 2007, I co-founded a nonprofit that we do work in Southern Africa to do. It started in health. We'd open clinics, but we realized other social services were needed. So our centers grew to have schools, clinic, organic garden programs. We brought water to villages for the first time, electricity. But yeah, it's all influenced by my parents, and it wasn't very like direct, them telling us what to do. It was, we witnessed their work and were inspired to do the same.
That is fascinating and amazing. I love that. And yes, we are going to talk more about the nonprofit. So that's great.
Yeah.
Now, for you, you're playing sports, and then the time comes to decide to go to college, and you decide, well, my dad went to Duke. Maybe Duke's a pretty good school. So initially, you elect to go to Duke.
Yeah, I was very influenced by my dad. He very much was yes, fulfill my legacy, go to Duke. And it's a phenomenal school. I had a really, really great experience. I played volleyball there simultaneous, but I lasted one semester, and it had nothing to do with my grades. I think I actually got like better grades at Duke than at UCLA, or like the average, but I had experienced this private school life before, and it was very similar to Sidwell. And I'm very influenced by my surroundings, and I'm very much a city girl. And North Carolina is like a small town. It's like a college town and very insulated. And I decided to transfer after one semester. And I remember like calling the UCLA volleyball coaches and being like, hi, may I come to your school, please? And so they helped initiate the transfer. And so I spent second semester of my freshman year in a new school. I transferred to UCLA.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So, being sports individuals, you and I both, the recruiting process, there's obviously multiple schools that are trying to attract you to their university. Was UCLA one of the top ones for you, and you had elected Duke over them, or how did you come back to UCLA?
Great question, because at the time, I know now volleyball is universal and it's everywhere, but back in the day, volleyball was a California sport. Hardly anyone in Maryland or the East Coast played it. It was very niche to California, and a lot of the recruiting was done in California. And no one knew. I was even in like a small private school in Maryland and DC, right? No one cared. So I actually made my mom tape my games in my high school games, VHS.
Yes.
And then I would somehow edit the videos. I don't know how I did that on VHS, but I made myself a recruiting video, and I sent it to, Stanford, Arizona, Texas, Berkeley, UCLA, USC, all of the top, and Penn State. These were all the top volleyball schools in the nation. And that was the start of me starting to cold reach out to these people I should not be talking to. But I had this dream of one day playing in one of the top 10 volleyball schools. And my reach outs worked. I ended up being recruited by really, really big schools, but it took my initiative first in sending these recruiting tapes. And I did get bite from, like Texas. I took a trip to Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, and my favorite was UCLA. And don't tell anyone this. It was because like they had really cute basketball players and football players, and the
I love it.
academics were really great.
Yeah.
No, actually, yeah, well, that's probably the real reason.
Hey, no one's going to judge you for that. I think deep down in all of us, that had a portion to do with where we decided to go to school.
They had cuter boys. Don't tell my dad, especially. No, but I took a lot of recruiting trips, and I really, really, really loved UCLA. And but Duke was Duke, right? So I took my chance, tried Duke, and decided it wasn't for me, and switched over to UCLA.
Absolutely. Well, hey, at the end of the day, no one's going to fault you for thinking UCLA is a good school to go to, because it is. I also want to give a shout out to moms across the world that record their kids at sporting events. My mom did that for me with basketball. Your mom with volleyball. It's like, man, the amount of hours that they just spent there looking through a little.
Honestly, thank you, moms.
Yes. So as you go to UCLA, like you said, UCLA is a powerhouse. They're one of the top programs in the country. And so when you're showing up there, I'm sure it's a very competitive environment. And, being 19 years old, I'm sure it can be a little bit intimidating. Talk about the process of getting ingrained as a freshman.
Yeah, well, academically first, UCLA is the best public university in the country. And at the time, UCLA was the best athletic school in the nation. We had the most national championships.
Yeah.
So in both, it was very competitive in the classroom and on the court. In fact, when I got to UCLA, my entire team was from California. I think we had like a Colorado girl or two Colorado girls, and maybe like a Texas girl, but it was majority California girls who had grown up eating, drinking, sleeping.
Yeah.
And I showed up, this East Coast girl, like, hey guys. And not only that, as soon as I got to UCLA and started practicing, my coaches realized my footwork was backwards. So I hadn't properly learned the sport. I was more of an athlete playing the sport of volleyball than a volleyball player. So I had to actually relearn the sport, relearn my arm swing, my footwork, everything. So I started over. Not only that, but I had to keep up with the girls who already knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So it was really challenging. But I put my all into it. And then by my junior and senior year, I became an All-American. And by senior year, we made it to the Final Four. And during that game, I was recruited to play professionally and train for the Olympics in Colorado Springs. So I put in the work and got results.
Okay, so we're not going to just fast forward through that. Yeah, hey, I was working on my footwork and then I became an All-American. So let's dig into that a little bit, because I think this is going to be a common theme throughout the rest of your life. And that is, realizing that, hey, maybe I'm not where someone else is at, but I have the capability to get there. So talk a little bit about, whether that's parents, coaches, friends, teammates that would either encourage you, or maybe you had a lack of that and you just had that internal drive to, prove to people you could.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. So it starts off that I'm a middle child. I have an older sister, she's firstborn, and a younger brother, he's the only boy. So I think my entire life is just me trying to get attention from people, like, oh, I am worthy. So there very much is an internal burn in me that I feel as if, and this does not have to be reality, but in my mind, I feel that I'm overlooked, and there's something in me that's like, oh no, I have to like be recognized, but in a humble way. It's not like I'm like screaming from rooftops like I'm the best, and I've had to work for everything that I've done. But I think it's the same with volleyball. I entered UCLA like nobody knew me. But I'm also very observant. I'm a learner. I'm curious. and I am coachable and I take feedback really, really well. So with all those in the pot, I'm able to realize what I need to do in order to excel. And I think that's really hard for people to take feedback and to change. But I'm very good at that, which can be a good and bad thing. That I'm very attuned to what people tell me and their feedback.
Yeah.
I'm now learning to have boundaries as well, because when you're listening too much to people, that can also affect you, because then you're completely always changing, giving
Right.
feedback, and you don't really have a filter. But I in my older years now, I'm beginning to filter that and figure out what is truly me and what I should listen to from other people. But yeah, at UCLA, it's a similar experience. And I mean, our day-to-days were super hard. We were both students and athletes. I also joined a sorority during my UCLA days. And at some point I had like a part-time job. I
Yeah.
was a barista, and I also worked at a clothing store down in Westwood Village. But like our mornings, we'd start practice at 7. So you'd have to get all your treatment, your heat, your taping your ankles by like 6:50 and be in the gym. And then we'd have 3-hour practice, and then we'd go to class, and then in the evenings we'd either have conditioning or weightlifting. And we were also one of the first schools to start yoga. And in
Yeah.
college, yoga was that seed was planted, which will like come into like my 30s, that
Yeah.
I very much become blossomed into wellness. And it kind of almost started there. I was introduced to this mindfulness and taking time to sit.
Yeah. So I want to rewind a little bit to the getting feedback from people. Um, so it was interesting. I was recording with a gentleman a little while ago, and he owns, multi-million-dollar businesses. And he said that when he was first going to pick his first job, he asked his mom, who was a second grade school teacher and wasn't very financially well-to-do, which job he should take. And she gave him advice, and he goes, I just don't think that's the right advice. Like, I'm going to pick the other option. And he came back to it and said, I think sometimes we go to people that we know care about us to get advice, but sometimes they're giving us the safe advice opposed to what might be the best advice. So, thinking about that for you and advice you've gotten, how has that played in your life?
Yeah, I mean, you even see it because my dad was like, you should go to Duke, right?
Yeah.
And then I tried it, and then something in my internal compass was like, turn this way instead. So, I'll say, yeah, the majority of my younger life, I was very much listening to what other people have said. And then I'll get into this too, but then I've been on the spiritual journey since maybe like my early 30s.
Yeah.
And what's grown in me is this connection and alignment where I now don't necessarily, no, I do need feedback from other people. I always will, but
Mhm.
there's a filter now where
Yeah.
I take the feedback, it goes through me, and I'm like, is this for me? Should I take that direction? Is this strategy fulfilling in what my life needs? Where in my younger years I was just taking it all in. I was taking it all in to the point where I didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's a balance, I think. Being able to, you need to hear feedback or else you become like a narcissist, really arrogant person. There needs to be some humility, but I've learned over the years how to balance it.
Yes, that's awesome. So we're progressing and you're doing well in volleyball. Like you said, you get this invitation to play professionally. You're training for the Olympics. I mean, that has to just be an immaculate feeling to go from, hey, 4 years ago, I was, gosh, I don't even, feel like I belong, or, I didn't feel like I was at the same level as these girls. And now, I mean, you've eclipsed probably some of them, most of them, and you're at the highest pinnacle of your sport.
Interesting. Yeah. But when you're in it, you don't realize what you've done.
Yeah.
I haven't even sat to think about what you just said, but like I've accomplished that. This is like an epiphany to me. But yeah, I did rise to become one of the best in my position in this country at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hitting me now.
Well, yeah, you sit there and think on that. Later today, you can shoot me a text and say,
Okay.
"Wow."
Yeah.
Let that sink in. Let that sink
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. So as you're doing or after you graduate, you then decide I'm going to do some postgraduate work at USC, right?
Yes. So first of all, USC and UCLA are rivals.
I wasn't going to call it out. I didn't want to, stir any bad blood there, but
yeah. So for me to go jump over to the other side of town to USC, I didn't tell a lot of my athlete friends that I was now at our rival. But at the time, my brother was actually attending the University of Southern California. So it was super nice to be on campus sometimes and grab lunch with him. And I was in a postgraduate pre-medical sciences program. It's called post-baccalaureate. And it's for undergrads who have graduated, but have decided that they want to go to medical school, but they've taken humanities or softer classes that you need a certain core class group in order to apply to medical school. And they're really intense classes. Yeah. It's chemistry, biology, calculus, organic chemistry, all the physics. And so it's condensed as well, where it would have taken an undergrad 4 years to do, you do it in something like 1.5 years or 2 years. So my brother is actually pre-med at USC, and he was always one class ahead of me. So if I was in bio 1, he was in bio 2. So what would happen is he'd give me his notes from the semester before. So my little brother was actually tutoring me in science.
That's a good brother.
Yeah. It was a great experience because I am not very science minded, although I've come to be, and the sciences that I learned definitely inform the work that I do now, because I do make wine, and all wine is an application of chemistry and biology. Yes. So that's an example of in my life where like I didn't go to medical school and I didn't become a doctor. And so it would have been like, what's the point of these 2 years that I spent studying science? It all made sense now because I know what fermentation is and how to like manipulate sugars and like all the yeast and microorganisms that I deal with because of my learnings back then. But not only was I in class, I would shadow surgeons at Cedars-Sinai. I was studying for the MCAT. But during this time, I was not bored, but I was a student and an athlete. There's always like many things happening in my life.
Yes.
And I missed competing in something. And one of my friends suggested I compete in pageants. And
yeah. So your friend says, "Hey, you're a competitive person. You're good looking. You got time. Why don't you compete for this thing called Miss Malibu?" And you're like, "Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I could, right? Like, why not?"
Yeah. So it was 2007. And per recommendation from a friend, I competed in my first pageant, Miss Malibu, and I was coming up being an athlete. I didn't know how to wear makeup. I'd never done it. Like I didn't know what mascara was. Like I didn't know what to do. Yeah. And I applied, got into the pageant, and I sewed my evening gown. Yes. I don't know how I even prepared for the interview portion, but I ended up winning Miss Malibu, which leads you on to Miss California, which I think it was at the time, or maybe Texas. It was between Texas and California, who had the most contestants. There were something like 300 girls who competed at California each year. Yeah. And so my Miss Malibu title took me on to Miss California USA. And I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna win. And I lost. I didn't even make the top 15. It was a very interesting evening that I didn't even break the top 15, which meant, something lit a fire in me. I was like, I'm coming back next year. Yes. There's something here. And there is something there in that a lot of people look at pageants very superficially, but it's a great opportunity for women to present yourself
Yeah.
fully in front of judges, in front of an audience. You really have to know the ins and outs of yourself, and how to present yourself in a full package. You have to be eating healthy in order to present yourself in a bikini or an evening gown. You have to be knowing of the world, because there's the final question on stage where you're answering questions about current events or in-depth topics. So it's a way to really create a package of who am I, in order to present yourself to thousands of people. And at the Miss USA level, it's millions of people.
Yeah. Well, and something that I think about that is if you were only focusing on the competition itself, I think you missed the boat a little bit, because so many of the skills that a person's learning in that, obviously I didn't go through it, so I don't know. I only know from secondhand information, but the skills that you're learning in that are so applicable and transferable to careers and future relationships and things like that.
Well, for sure. I'm never nervous for interviews now. Okay, I maybe am sometimes, but the amount of interviews I've done on stage and backstage,
Yes.
I need to know how to prepare really well for when I'm going to encounter another, and I will be probed with questions. But yes, definitely, it's you learn a lot of skill sets that are transferable to job interviews, to media interviews. But yeah, it's more than what people think pageants are.
Yeah. So you hit on it. The first one didn't place. So now is where we start growing this resiliency muscle.
Yeah.
So we would love to say year two, I compete again, and this is the year I win. But talk a little bit about the next few years.
So I need to count how many times I went back to California, but it was many, 4 or 5 times.
I think you said 4. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. And never won. I never won California. The highest I got was second place. So my first year, I didn't place at all. My second year, I worked really hard because I'd gone through it. I studied and I bettered myself. And I came back and I made the top 5, which is a really, really big deal.
Yeah.
But I lost. I didn't win. And then I think it was the next year, I became second place. And the girl who won that year is married to Michael Phelps. So the competition was very, very steep. It was really, like legitimate women who were beautiful and intelligent.
Yes.
And then the next year, I think I made the top 5 again. So you age out of these pageants. At 26, you can no longer compete. So I think I was like 25 or 26 at the time. And so it was my last chance to win a state title. And when you win a state title, you're on to the big show, the Miss USA pageant. And so I had done studying at USC, and I decided to move home to Maryland and give my home state a try. So I competed for Miss Maryland USA, and it was my final chance. And that night I made the top 15, I made the top 10. All of a sudden I'm in the top 5. And I'm like, oh my God, please, I really, really want to go to Miss USA, please. And then it was the final 2. It was me and another girl. And I was like, I know this place before. I've been top 2 before. And I was like, please, I'm praying, please let me win. And I won. And I became Miss Maryland USA. Which meant I was on to Miss USA. So yeah.
Yes. So I want to unpack a couple of things. One, if you're watching this, you're probably sitting there saying, aren't you like 24 now? No, because that's about how old she looks. She's kept her youthful vibe. So no, she did get a little bit older in those things. Now, the second thing though, that I wanted to highlight in what she talked about is kind of goals and progressing there. So I think sometimes we have this ultimate goal, and if we don't hit it, we regress or we lose confidence or we lose steam. But you saw each progression in your California competitions as I'm getting closer. I'm getting closer. So talk a little bit about just the mindset of, even though I wasn't hitting my ultimate goal, I was working towards it. And that gave me, momentum and encouragement to keep going.
Yeah, and it's informed my startup life, because there's a lot of no's when you have a really high arching goal. It is not a straightforward path. And I think the media really evangelizes winners, and their stories are so like glorious, and the story of no is never told.
Right.
No's are actually a blessing, and you really have to have your eye on what you want to become, because and take no's, because they're clues. When someone says no, you should look at why like
Mm,
what is there, what information is there that I can, take to better what I'm like working towards.
yeah.
Well, I don't know. Like I didn't win when I got as high as second place at Miss California, and I was like, what have I done wrong?
Mm,
Maybe it's, I don't know. You take the feedback and you
yep.
better your strategy on how to reapproach, um, what you're aspiring to. And also, I look back on the no's now, and what ended up happening is, I ended up achieving this goal of, I eventually become Miss USA. Uh,
Yeah.
so the years that I didn't win California, who knows, if I had become Miss California, maybe that year I wouldn't have become Miss USA.
Mm,
So it's all due timing, and the story unfolds. So you may be in it now and you're like not getting what you want, but you have to keep going because it's all a part of the journey.
yes. Oh, that's so good. Now, it's tough to rank moments, but I'm going to make you do it because, well, I can. And so, would you say competing in like the Final Four or winning Miss Maryland? I mean, how do those compare? What was the feelings like in each of those?
Similar feelings,
Yeah.
and that's another thing. Like, my life is not always winning moments. Like, I'll have these peak experiences, and then like it gets real quiet, and I'm like, who am I? What am I
Yeah.
working towards?
Yeah.
But moments have very similar feelings. Like, the air is different, and
Mm,
I can tell when I'm working towards something and it's about to culminate, and I just need to hang on and keep going,
yeah.
and drumming up energy to like reach these peak moments. But there were differences, yeah, because volleyball is a team sport. Pageants, you're up there half naked by yourself, and you need to answer questions.
Yeah.
Voice. Where in volleyball you have a team to rely on. But again, what if your team's not playing well? Like, in
Right.
volleyball, team sport, if your team's not doing well, you're not doing well. Where in
Yeah.
pageants, you're not doing well, you have the control to be like, okay, I need to shake myself out of this, and you have no one else to direct. So they were both very good lessons and very similar feelings, just in the context of other people and in the context of being on your own.
Yeah, that's good. Now, something that you mentioned there, and so this has been, I was taught this in the sixth grade. A guy that was coaching me with basketball gave me this book, and it talked about the human highlight reel, and it forever has changed my life. And I think one thing we don't do well as humans is we get caught up in our thoughts and we don't realize that we're even having some of those negative thoughts you had mentioned, where some days, I'm at the pinnacle, and other days I feel like I'm down here. And so the book talked about, well, create or remember 3 or 4 moments in your life that you can kind of replay for about a minute, and you feel the moment and you can completely change the trajectory of your thoughts. And so I did that. And I just remember, after a bad basketball game, or now in my professional career, after a tough business day, or, a deal doesn't go as planned, I can't take that negative energy into my next experience. Otherwise, it's going to set it on a roller coaster of bad. So I have to be able to take my energy and focus it on something more positive. And so having that human highlight reel of some of those moments, obviously I didn't play in any Final Fours or win any Miss or Mr. States of anything, but having those moments that can kind of change your trajectory of thinking.
Wow, that's such great advice. And what's funny is, like, spiritual people talk about this, that in order to like manifest, you embody, feelings of positivity and happiness. And so, I'm very bad at sitting in celebration of the accomplishments that I've done.
Yeah.
I Okay, I did that, on to the next.
Mhm.
But it's very interesting to be mindful of when you're in those moments, so you remember how it feels that you've accomplished something. So that, yes, on bad days, you can sit and be like, okay, I got this. Let me just embody that energy. That is such great advice. I'm going to use that.
Perfect. At least I could help you a little bit today. You're helping a ton of people and me, so I love it. Perfect. So you win Miss Maryland, And now, like you said, you get to go compete for Miss USA. And this is a extensive process, but something I want you to highlight in that process was the workouts and the difference between maybe week 1 and week 2, and then the last few days where you, Rhode Island, and Ohio are still there. So talk a little bit about that.
So yeah, leading up to the Miss USA competition, so I win Maryland, and I'm like, yay! And then I'm like, next day, day one, being on the journey to Miss USA because I want this title.
Yes.
Not in like a very, I'm like, I can't explain this, but like, I'm not overtly like, I'm gonna go cut up your dress and like put a powder in your bikini. I very much, when I'm competing for something, I'm very hard on myself.
Yeah.
I'm not very outward and being like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go like terrorize Arizona or like
Yeah.
it's very much like I'm gonna like terrorize myself. But so with that said, I'm very hard on myself when I'm competing for something, and leading up to Miss USA was just the same. I did double days. I was in the gym twice a day. I was eating super well. I was paying attention to the news and forming opinion and starting to realize who I was and where I stood, and beginning to prepare myself to present myself. Because at the time, there was no Instagram. I was the first Miss USA on Instagram.
Let's go.
Yeah, we were in the airing of Miss Teen USA, Miss USA, and Miss Universe. At the time, we were one of the most watched world events besides the Olympics and the World Cup. So it was like a major thing. Now there's a lot of distractions like TikTok and whatever.
Right.
We were the it girls at the time. So I would prepare, and then come competition, it's actually 4 weeks long. It's aired one night, and people don't know this, but the girls are there for 4 weeks. And our host city at the time was Vegas. And so I moved to Las Vegas and we stayed at the Planet Hollywood, and they would sanction an entire floor for all of the states. And we were chaperoned everywhere. You were not allowed to go off on your own and see your family or your boyfriend or go work out at the gym.
Wow.
You were regimented. You had a schedule. You needed to be somewhere. And often our mornings and our day of events started really early, sometimes even like 7 a.m. So when we first got there, like the first 2 weeks, everyone's really excited to be there and enthusiastic and ambitious. So at 4, 5 a.m., you see girls out in the hallway working out because we weren't allowed to go to the gym. Like girls running the floors and they're like stretch bands and like weights and whatever in the hallway. But by week 3 and 4, the endurance in a lot of girls, and it's hard. It's like a hard thing. It's very mentally taxing and physically taxing. But by the last week, the last lead up to the telecast of Miss USA, there were just 3 girls I remember left waking up at 4 a.m. to make our 7 a.m. events. And it was me, Rhode Island, and Ohio. And we ended up being the last ones standing on final night. So I always love telling that story because there's something in persistence and putting in backstage, and it filtered into who was left the final night.
Yeah. So we said, hey, you become the top person. However, on the night of decision, that may or may not actually be the case.
Yeah. So my story and road to Miss USA is very interesting. I was the last 2 standing. It was me and Rhode Island, and there was drama and friction and like suspense in the air. That's the word, suspense. Yeah. And the announcer was like, okay, first runner up is, which means the person they don't say is Miss USA. So first runner up is Maryland. So I didn't win. I didn't end up winning Miss USA that night. Rhode Island won.
Yes.
And I don't remember like the feeling in that moment. I was fine with it. I was super happy for her, and I was fine with it. There was a little like, wow, I really thought that that's the weirdest feeling, because I mean, I really embodied and thought that I was going to be Miss USA.
Yeah.
To the point where I was like, I guess that's not true. That's so weird. In like a very like, um, I don't know, like on another level of like, there was a knowing that I was Miss USA, and I was just really
Yeah.
that it didn't play out. But I was like, no, well, good job, Rhode Island. You're gorgeous. Go on to Miss Universe and have a great time. What a road that was. I got as high as the top two, and that took as a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And so I was content, and I left the pageant, and I think I traveled a lot in that summer. And then it came to Miss Universe night, and I think it was like 4 or 5 months later, or 6, something like that. And Miss Universe competition was on. I wasn't even going to watch it. And my roommate at the time was like, no, 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 let's watch it. She worked I was in New York now. I was living in New York. She worked at a bar, and she's like, no, just come watch it. I'll like pay for your dinner, and you can have come. So it was in Midtown, the bar. So I went to the bar, and she put it on, and the other TVs had like basketball and football, and then people like were watching the Miss Universe pageant, and we're like requesting it on other TVs. So by the end of the night, Miss Universe was like on all the TVs. And so what happened was Rhode Island, or Miss USA, she became Miss USA Rhode Island. She kept progressing. She kept being in the 10, the 15, the 10, the 5, and then all of a sudden she's final 2.
Yeah.
And like, Nana, if she wins, you become Miss USA, you realize. And that's what ended up happening. So the girl who won Miss USA became Miss Universe, and like a vice president would ascend to president if something happened. I, in that moment, became Miss USA, and I've never seen my phone like blow up. It actually like blew up. Like I got so many text messages and so many calls,
Yeah.
including from my mom, which is just like, it's just 2 minutes of her screaming like, oh my God, oh my God. And so, yeah, the very next morning, I got a phone call from the Miss Universe organization, and they were like, we're sure you heard. Would you like to accept the job of Miss USA? And I said, yes, please. Like, yes. And so that knowing that I was this thing was actually true. And so I ended up becoming Miss USA.
Whoa! That's awesome. So I like how you talk about embodying that and almost having that feeling like, hey, I really felt like that was going to happen. And then it ends up happening. I think there's something powerful about, believing you're going to achieve it, seeing yourself in that role before it ever happens.
Yeah. And that things aren't going to happen the way you think they are.
Yeah.
That, like, you're like, okay, I'm totally gonna get this job. Let me just walk into this room. But you may have to like go to the other building, go downstairs, go in the side door, but then you go, right?
Yeah.
So there was this knowing, but it didn't turn out the way I thought it was. And again, not in an arrogant way. It was really like this thread in me was like, you're totally this thing. Like, how did you not become that thing? Oh, well, but it was true. And so, yeah, it's things don't always turn out the way you think they will, but like embody that feeling and
Yeah. Well, so a question I have for you just about confidence and growing it. And I know, just kind of listening to you talk about, in high school, I wasn't necessarily the most popular person, but then I went to a big university. I was a star athlete on a great team. Then I won, some of these contests. Maybe talk a little bit about how confidence comes from who you're becoming and not so much a title that you held or a position you played or an accomplishment that you got.
Yeah. So these peak things I've done, like becoming an athlete, becoming Miss USA, actually didn't spring from confidence. They came from insecurity.
Hmm.
All that Miss USA is like an entire nation embracing you. And that was my insecurity, that in high school, like no one wanted to hang out with me because I was like too tall and like super quiet and awkward.
Yeah.
There's this thing in me like super insecure of like, do people like me? Like, and then I think that was like the seed, like Miss USA is that people like you. So yeah, I mean, there's something to say about confidence, but I think it can also be a detriment.
Hmm.
And for me, honestly, what's driven me and fueled me is that I can be better, and I need to answer these, longings in me by aspiring to these ridiculous things.
I love it. So one thing I do want to highlight, by the way, is that you are the only Miss Maryland to take that title, because I researched it. And technically there was one before you, but she's a cheat and she was married, so she does not count.
Oh, oh my God, that's so cool.
Yeah, so there was one before you that ended up winning Miss USA, but yeah, I guess allegedly she was married, so they end up rescinding it. Someone else won. So you are the only. We're just gonna acknowledge that.
Oh, thank you for that. I should know that, but I don't. Thank you.
It's okay. You now know. Oh no. Well, good. So I want to end this portion on a question. So you actually talked about it a little bit earlier, but the idea that was explained to me was this concept of what I call blissful dissatisfaction. So that's a lot in 2 words, but it's the idea that some people peak early in life because they hit their first goal, and then what their goal is to just maintain that, which isn't a bad thing. That's just the way some people's lives end up. Then there are other people that every time they hit a goal, they're on to the next goal right away. It's like, oh, well, that was really cool, but I'm already going to be on to the next one. And so the blissful dissatisfaction is, how do I enjoy a moment of success without losing my vigor for the next goal? So talk a little bit about how that's played in your life with all the things that you've been able to accomplish.
Great question. Yeah, I mean, when I was at the peak of playing volleyball, I was like, okay, I'm going to go be Miss USA now. My life comes in cycles, and it's almost like 4-year cycles where, I'll reach something and then it starts to fade. Like my athleticism was like, okay, my shoulder's falling off. Like I don't feel passionate about this when I'm on the court. Like there has to be something more. And there's like it, in that dwindle, like it's kind of like a sad, dark time where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm losing my identity as an athlete. Is this over? Like, is there anything left in me? Who am I?
Yeah.
And so like I'll reach these peak things, and that's what's written about me. But in between, there's like these 2 or 3 years where I'm trying to figure out, what am I doing? Like, what is next? What do I need to do to prepare myself? As I said, like I was coming off sports and I didn't know how to even wear makeup. Like there's that 2 to 3 years of like, okay, how do I put myself together to reach this like thing of Miss USA?
Yeah.
So yeah, there is in that decline though, I think a lot of people lose like the motivation to rebuild another identity, where I just being curious and motivated. I'm like, no, I have to recreate something. I have to keep going. And so, yeah, even when I'm at a peak, I don't think I'm looking for what's next, because there's no room to.
Right.
In the decline of an identity where I'm like, okay, I need to rebuild myself to something else, which is a hard thing, because letting go of an identity is like a depressing thing. Like you can think of it as like mothers letting their kids go to college. If you're losing a mother, or like you losing a job, like you have to recreate, like over and over again in your life, it's a cycle, and you have to like kind of find a new fire and retell your story, at least for me, every 4 years or something like that.
Yeah.
But it takes courage and perseverance and persistence to rebuild again.
Absolutely. Well, Nana, thanks so much for sharing a first part of the story. So excited to have so many people take great takeaways from not only your experience and perseverance in the athletic part, but then in your goals of becoming Miss United States. So thanks so much.
Thank you.